Have you ever felt like you were walking into a trap, but you went anyway just to see what would happen? That's exactly how I felt when my fiancé Marcus invited me to dinner with his family for the first time. I should have trusted my gut feeling that something was off, but love has a way of making us ignore the warning signs, doesn't it? What I'm about to share with you changed not only my relationship, but also my entire perspective on the people we choose to bring into our lives. This isn't just a story about a disastrous family dinner. It's about discovering who someone really is when they think you're not paying attention. And trust me, what I found out that night still sends chills down my spine. I remember standing in front of my closet that Saturday afternoon, my hands trembling slightly as I tried to decide what to wear. Marcus had been unusually insistent about this dinner, almost pushy in a way that didn't match his normally relaxed personality. We'd been together for 2 years, engaged for 6 months, and somehow I'd managed to avoid meeting his parents until now. He always had excuses. They were traveling, they were busy, the timing wasn't right, but suddenly it was urgent that I meet them before we set a wedding date. The way he said it made my stomach twist with an uncomfortable feeling I couldn't quite name. I pulled out my favorite navy blue dress, the one that made me feel confident and professional, but then I hesitated. Something about the tone in Marcus's voice when he described his family made me pause. He'd mentioned, almost too casually, that his mother was very traditional, that his father was old-fashioned about certain things, and that I should just be myself, but maybe not too much myself. What does that even mean? Not too much myself? The phrase had been rolling around in my mind for days, and the more I thought about it, the more questions I had. Why would the person who claimed to love me want me to be less than who I truly was? I'm a successful corporate lawyer, I have 2 master's degrees, I speak 4 languages fluently, and I've worked incredibly hard to get where I am in life. My parents immigrated to this country with nothing but dreams and determination, and they instilled in me the value of education and self-improvement. So why did I feel like I was about to walk into a situation where all of that would somehow be wrong? The unease grew stronger as I stood there, dress in hand, staring at my reflection in the mirror. I looked at the woman staring back at me, professional, accomplished, independent, and I wondered if that was the woman Marcus actually wanted me to be. We'd had such a beautiful relationship, or so I thought. He was charming, attentive, romantic in all the ways that had swept me off my feet. But lately there had been small comments here and there, little suggestions about how I could be softer, more agreeable, less focused on my career. I'd brushed them off as him wanting to spend more time together, but now, standing in my bedroom preparing for this dinner, those comments took on a different meaning. My best friend Rachel had warned me about this moment. She'd said that meeting the parents often reveals the future version of your partner, that people eventually become their parents whether they want to admit it or not. I'd laughed it off at the time, but her words echoed in my mind now. What if she was right? What if this dinner was going to show me something about Marcus I wasn't ready to see? But here's where my story takes an unexpected turn, and I need you to stay with me because what I did next was completely out of character for me, yet it ended up being the most revealing decision I've ever made. Instead of wearing that navy blue dress and presenting myself as the educated, successful woman I am, I made a choice that would change everything. I decided to play a role, to become someone completely different, to test a theory that was forming in the back of my mind. Was Marcus ashamed of who I really was? Did his family have expectations that I would never meet? And more importantly, how would they treat someone they perceived as beneath them? I put the navy dress back in the closet and pulled out something entirely different, a simple, slightly ill-fitting outfit that looked like it came from a thrift store, which it did, from a costume party I'd attended years ago. I tied my hair back in a messy style, removed my tasteful jewelry, and practiced speaking with grammatical errors and a less refined vocabulary. I looked in the mirror again, and the transformation was startling. I looked like someone who'd never finished high school, someone who worked minimum wage jobs, someone who Marcus's apparently sophisticated family would likely look down upon. My heart was racing as I practiced my new persona, dropping my G's, using ain't and double negatives, simplifying my vocabulary to something a middle schooler might use. It felt wrong, almost like I was betraying myself, but something stronger than doubt was driving me forward. I needed to know the truth. I needed to see how Marcus and his family would treat someone they considered uneducated, unsophisticated, unworthy. Because if they couldn't show basic human decency and respect to that version of me, then what did that say about their values? What did that say about the man I was planning to marry? As I applied minimal makeup and deliberately made myself look as plain as possible, I thought about all the times Marcus had made comments about other people, the waiter who got our order wrong, the grocery store clerk who was too slow, the homeless person asking for change. He'd never been outright cruel, But there was a dismissiveness in his tone, a subtle contempt for people he perceived as less than himself. I'd excused it, rationalized it, told myself he was just having bad days, but now I wondered if I'd been ignoring a fundamental flaw in his character. The drive to his parents' house took 45 minutes, and with every mile my anxiety grew. Marcus picked me up, and the look on his face when he saw me was the first test. His smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, a micro-expression of confusion and perhaps disappointment before he recovered. He didn't say anything about my appearance, which in itself was telling. Normally he'd compliment me, tell me I looked beautiful. But tonight there was just silence. An uncomfortable, heavy silence that filled the car like a thick fog. As we drove through increasingly affluent neighborhoods, past manicured lawns and houses that looked like they belonged in architecture magazines, I felt the weight of what I was about to do. This wasn't just a harmless experiment. This was a calculated test that would either confirm my fears or prove them wrong. Either way, our relationship would never be the same after tonight. Marcus finally broke the silence as we turned onto his parents' street. His voice was tight, controlled, like he was choosing his words very carefully. He reminded me again that his parents were traditional, that his mother could be particular about things, that his father valued hard work and success. The subtext was clear. Don't embarrass me. Don't be too opinionated. Don't challenge them. Be small, be quiet, be acceptable. Every word out of his mouth confirmed what I was beginning to suspect. He didn't want them to meet the real me. He wanted them to meet some watered-down, palatable version that would fit into their worldview, and that realization hurt more than I expected it to. We pulled up to a mansion, there's no other word for it, with white columns, a circular driveway, and a fountain in the front yard. This wasn't just wealth, this was generational money, the kind that comes with expectations and traditions, and a very specific worldview about who belongs in their circle and who doesn't. My hands were sweating as Marcus turned off the car, and I could see him taking a deep breath, preparing himself for something. That's when I knew for certain that this dinner was about more than just meeting his family. It was some kind of test or evaluation, and I was determined to find out exactly what they were really looking for. Marcus led me to the front door, his hand on the small of my back with a pressure that felt more controlling than supportive. And as we stood there waiting for someone to answer, I transformed completely into my role, slouching slightly, chewing gum I'd brought specifically for this purpose, and preparing to speak in a way that would make my English professors weep. The door opened, and there stood a woman who could only be Marcus's mother. Perfectly coiffed blonde hair, designer dress, pearl necklace, and an expression that was already evaluating me from head to toe before we'd even exchanged greetings. Her smile was practiced, polite, but it didn't reach her eyes, and I could see the exact moment she took in my appearance, the flash of something dark crossing her face before she composed herself. Marcus introduced us, and I extended my hand while saying, "Real nice to meet ya, Mrs. Henderson. Marcus has told me so much about y'all." I deliberately used poor grammar and a slightly exaggerated casual tone, and I watched as her handshake became limper, her smile more forced. She invited us in, and the house was exactly what I expected. Museum-quality furniture, original artwork on the walls, fresh flowers in crystal vases, everything screaming old money and refined taste. Marcus's father appeared from what looked like a study, tall, distinguished, wearing a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. His assessment of me was even less subtle than his wife's. His eyes moved from my scuffed shoes to my cheap clothing, to my unstyled hair, and I could see the disappointment settle over his features like a cloud. We moved into the dining room, which was set with china that looked antique and precious, multiple forks and spoons at each place setting, crystal wine glasses catching the light from an enormous chandelier. I knew exactly which fork to use for what. I'd attended enough business dinners and formal events to navigate the most complicated place settings, but tonight I was going to pretend I didn't have a clue. As we sat down, Marcus's mother, Patricia, began the conversation by asking about how we met. I launched into my rehearsed story, keeping my grammar deliberately poor and my vocabulary simple. Well, we met at this bar, and Marcus, he was real sweet, bought me a drink and all, and we just started talking and stuff. He's real nice, like super nice. I could feel Marcus tensing beside me, his leg pressed against mine under the table in what I assumed was meant to be a warning. Patricia's smile was becoming more strained by the second, and she exchanged a look with her husband that I wasn't supposed to see, but caught perfectly. It was a look that said, "Is this really the best he could do?" The judgment was palpable, hanging in the air like humidity before a storm. Dinner was served by actual staff, which shouldn't have surprised me given the house, but it added another layer to the performance I was giving. As courses came and went, I deliberately used the wrong fork, held my wine glass incorrectly, and at one point I even said, "This is real fancy. I ain't never had food this good." Patricia actually winced. Marcus's father, Robert, began asking me questions about my background, my family, my work, and I carefully crafted answers that painted a picture of someone from a completely different socioeconomic class. I told them I worked retail, that I'd gone to community college but didn't finish, that my family was from the other side of town, which in a city like ours carried very specific connotations. I watched their faces as I spoke, cataloging every micro-expression, every subtle sign of disdain and superiority. Patricia asked, with a tone that tried to sound casual but came across as condescending, "And what are your career aspirations, dear? Do you have plans to further your education?" I shrugged and said, "I mean, I'm pretty happy where I'm at, you know. Retail ain't so bad, and I get a discount on stuff, which is cool. I ain't really thought about going back to school or nothing. That stuff's expensive, and I'm not real good at studying and all that." The look Patricia and Robert exchanged this time was even more telling. It was pure horror mixed with disappointment, and, if I'm being completely honest, a kind of cruel satisfaction, like their worst fears about their son's choice of partner were being confirmed. Marcus was barely eating, pushing food around his plate, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle working. Part of me felt guilty for putting him through this, but a larger part of me needed to see how far this would go, how badly they would treat someone they deemed inferior, and most importantly, whether Marcus would defend me or join them in their judgment. The conversation continued through multiple courses, and with each passing minute, Patricia and Robert became less subtle in their condescension. Patricia began speaking to me more slowly, as if I might not understand regular-paced English, and she started explaining things that didn't need explanation, like how wine was made or what a particular vegetable was. Robert's questions became more pointed, more clearly designed to highlight what he perceived as the vast gap between their family and me. He asked about my parents' professions, and I told him my father worked in construction and my mother cleaned houses, which was actually close to the truth. My father had been a construction worker when we first came to this country before he started his own successful contracting business, and my mother had cleaned houses before she became a nurse. But I left out the endings of those stories, the parts about their success and upward mobility, because I wanted to see exactly how these people would react to someone whose family did honest working-class labor. The reaction was everything I feared and expected. Robert actually said, with a patronizing smile, "Well, there's certainly nothing wrong with honest work. We need people to do those jobs." The way he said "those jobs" made my blood boil, but I kept my composure, nodding and smiling like I didn't catch the insult. Patricia chimed in, "Oh yes, absolutely. Not everyone is cut out for university and professional careers. The world needs all types." The condescension was dripping from every word, and I had to dig my nails into my palm under the table to keep from breaking character and telling them exactly what I thought of their elitist attitudes. But then something happened that I wasn't expecting. Something that made this whole uncomfortable evening take a turn into territory I hadn't anticipated. Patricia excused herself from the table, mentioning she needed to check on dessert, and Robert followed shortly after, saying he needed to make an important phone call. That left Marcus and me alone at the dining table, and the silence between us was deafening. I expected him to lean over, to whisper an apology, to show some sign that he was uncomfortable with how his parents were treating me, but instead, he just sat there, staring at his plate, his face unreadable. Finally he spoke, but his words weren't what I wanted to hear. "You could try a bit harder," he said quietly, not even looking at me. "Try harder at what?" I asked, still maintaining my character but feeling genuine confusion. "At making a good impression, at fitting in, at being what they expect." His voice was low, almost a whisper, but the words hit me like a physical blow. This was the man I was planning to marry, and he was upset with me for not adequately performing for his parents, not for being myself, but for not being good enough at pretending to be someone they would approve of. Except he didn't know I was pretending. He thought this was really me, or at least a version of me he was seeing for the first time. The realization crystallized in that moment. Marcus had never truly accepted me for who I was. He'd been hoping I could be molded, shaped, transformed into whatever his family would deem acceptable. Before I could respond, I heard voices coming from somewhere in the house, and they weren't being particularly quiet. In fact, they seemed to have forgotten that sound travels in these big houses with their high ceilings and hardwood floors. I couldn't make out all the words at first, but I heard Marcus's name, and I heard enough of the tone to know they were discussing me. Something inside me shifted. The anger I'd been suppressing, the hurt I'd been swallowing down, it all transformed into a cold, clear determination. I needed to hear what they were really saying. I needed to know the full truth before I made any decisions about my future. I stood up, telling Marcus I needed to use the restroom, and he pointed me in the direction without much interest, still sulking at the table. But instead of going to the bathroom, I moved quietly through the house, following the sound of voices. Years of moving silently through library stacks during late-night study sessions had made me good at being quiet when I needed to be, and I found myself standing just outside what appeared to be a kitchen, where Patricia and Robert were speaking in hushed but intense tones. What I heard next made my heart pound and my hands shake, but I forced myself to stay still, to listen to every word, because this was the truth I'd been looking for, the reality behind the polite smiles and proper table manners. Patricia's voice came first, sharp and filled with barely contained anger that she'd been hiding behind her society smile all evening, and her words cut through me like shards of ice, even though I'd been half expecting something like this all along. I cannot believe Marcus is seriously considering marrying that girl, Robert. Did you see her? Did you hear the way she speaks? She's absolutely unsuitable, completely beneath our family's standards, and I will not have my son throwing his life away on some uneducated nobody from the wrong side of town. The venom in her voice was startling, all pretense of civility completely abandoned now that she thought I was safely out of earshot. Robert's response was equally disturbing, his deep voice carrying a coldness that sent chills down my spine. I agree entirely, Patricia. This is unacceptable. Marcus has responsibilities to this family, to our reputation, to the legacy we've built. He cannot marry someone so clearly inferior in every way that matters. What would people think? What would our friends say? Imagine bringing her to the club, to charity events. She'd be an embarrassment. They continued talking, their words becoming more cruel and cutting with each sentence, discussing me as if I were some kind of defective product Marcus had mistakenly purchased. Patricia mentioned something about family money, about trusts and inheritances, about how they'd structured things specifically to ensure Marcus married appropriately. We've always had the clause in the trust, Robert, remember? If he marries someone we don't approve of, someone who doesn't meet our standards, the inheritance is significantly reduced. Maybe it's time we reminded him of that little detail. My mind was reeling, trying to process what I was hearing. They'd literally set up financial incentives for their son to marry the right kind of person, which meant someone from their social class. Someone who looked right, sounded right, came from the right background. But then Robert said something that made my blood run completely cold. Something that reframed this entire evening and my entire relationship with Marcus in a way I hadn't even considered. The thing is, Patricia, I don't think he's actually serious about marrying her. I think this is some kind of phase, some rebellion against our expectations. Remember how he was in college? Dating all those inappropriate girls to get a rise out of us? This feels similar. He'll get it out of his system, enjoy whatever he's enjoying about being with someone so different from his usual type, and then he'll come to his senses and find someone appropriate. Patricia made a sound of agreement, and then she added, "You might be right. I noticed he seemed almost embarrassed by her tonight, like he was seeing her differently now that she's here in our home, surrounded by our things, compared to our standards. Sometimes people don't realize how incompatible they are until they see their partner in a different context. And I think that's exactly what's happening tonight." The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. Marcus had brought me here knowing his parents would judge me, knowing I wouldn't fit their standards, possibly even hoping that I would feel so out of place, so uncomfortable, that I would end the relationship myself, saving him from having to do the difficult work of breaking up with me directly. Or worse, he was testing me to see if I could somehow transform myself into what they wanted, if I would be willing to erase everything about who I was to fit into their world. But there was more, Patricia continued. I've already spoken to Marcus about Bethany Worthington. You remember her? The Worthingtons from the country club? She just finished her MBA from Harvard. Her family has connections in all the right places, and she's always had a soft spot for Marcus. I ran into her mother last week, and we had a lovely conversation about how nice it would be if our families became even closer through marriage. The implication was crystal clear. They weren't just disapproving of me. They were actively planning Marcus's future with someone else, someone they deemed appropriate, and they were discussing it as if my relationship with their son was already over, as if I was just a temporary inconvenience that would soon be resolved. Robert laughed, and said, "Well, after tonight, I don't think you'll have much trouble convincing him that this current situation isn't sustainable. Did you see his face during dinner? He looked like he wanted to disappear. I think he's already realizing his mistake." They started discussing logistics, how they would introduce Marcus to Bethany properly, what events they could all attend together, how they would ease him out of his relationship with me and into something more suitable. And with every word, I felt my anger building. Not just at them, but at Marcus, for being the kind of person who had parents like this, for not standing up to them, for potentially being complicit in this whole twisted situation. I stood there in the hallway, hidden just out of sight, and I had to make a decision about what to do with this information. Part of me wanted to storm in there, to confront them directly, to reveal that I'd heard every disgusting word they'd said. But another part of me, the smarter part that had gotten me through law school and into a successful career, knew that there was a better way to handle this, a way that would expose not just their cruelty, but also Marcus's true character. I thought about all the times he'd made those little comments, all the times he'd suggested I could be different, softer, less ambitious, less myself, and I realized that he'd been trying to mold me into someone his parents would approve of all along. He'd just been more subtle about it than they were. Have you ever had a moment where you suddenly see your entire relationship in a completely different light? Where all the little red flags you ignored or explained away suddenly form a clear picture of something you didn't want to see? That's what was happening to me in that hallway, listening to these people discuss my relationship like it was a business transaction gone wrong. I could hear them wrapping up their conversation, Patricia saying something about bringing out dessert and getting through the rest of the evening, maintaining appearances until they could get me out of their house, and I knew I needed to move quickly. I slipped back toward the dining room, my mind working at lightning speed, processing everything I'd heard and formulating a plan. When I returned to the table, Marcus looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Was it guilt? Embarrassment? Resignation? I sat down and smiled at him, still playing my role, still the unsophisticated girl who didn't belong in this world, and I could see the conflict playing across his features. He opened his mouth to say something, maybe to apologize, maybe to explain, but before he could speak, Patricia and Robert returned with dessert, their masks of politeness firmly back in place, acting as if they hadn't just been in the kitchen dissecting me and my unsuitability for their precious son. The dessert was some elaborate French pastry that probably cost more than most people's weekly grocery bill, and as Patricia served it, she made a point of explaining what it was, pronouncing the French name slowly and carefully, as if teaching a child a new word. This is a millefeuille, dear. It's a traditional French pastry with layers of puff pastry and pastry cream. Have you ever had anything like this before? Her tone was so patronizing it took everything in me not to respond in fluent French, which I speak perfectly thanks to 3 years studying at the Sorbonne during my undergraduate summers. But I maintained my character, shaking my head and saying, "Nah, this is real fancy. I usually just get desserts from the grocery store bakery, you know? The ones in the plastic containers." Patricia's smile was tight, victorious, confirming everything she believed about me. Robert steered the conversation toward topics he clearly thought I couldn't contribute to meaningfully, discussing politics, current events, complex business matters, and each time I gave simple, uninformed responses, I could see the satisfaction growing in their eyes. They were building their case, confirming their assessment, preparing their arguments for why Marcus needed to end this relationship. Marcus participated minimally in the conversation, mostly pushing his dessert around his plate, and I wondered what was going through his mind. Was he ashamed of me? Ashamed of himself? Was he planning how to break up with me, or was he actually considering standing up to his parents for once in his life? The more I watched him, the more I realized that I didn't really know this man I'd agreed to marry. I knew the version of himself he'd chosen to show me. But the real Marcus, the one who existed in relation to his family and their expectations, was a stranger. As the evening wound down and Patricia was walking us toward the door, she put her hand on my arm in a gesture that might have seemed motherly if I didn't know the truth, and she said, "It was so lovely to meet you, dear. I hope we'll see you again soon." The lie was so smooth, so practiced, and I smiled back at her, matching her false sweetness with my own, saying, "Oh yeah, this was real nice. Y'all got a beautiful home. Thanks for having me." The drive back to my apartment was silent at first, Marcus gripping the steering wheel tightly, staring straight ahead, and I sat there wondering if he was going to say anything, if he was going to acknowledge how terribly his parents had treated me, if he was going to defend me or apologize or show any sign that he recognized how wrong that entire evening had been. Finally, about halfway home, he spoke, and his words confirmed every fear I'd developed over the course of the evening. "That didn't go as well as I'd hoped," he said carefully, and I could hear him choosing his words, trying to find a diplomatic way to say what he was thinking. "What do you mean?" I asked, still playing my part, but also genuinely curious about how he would frame this. I just think maybe you could have tried to connect with them more. Shown interest in the things they were talking about, asked questions, engaged more with the conversation. He was criticizing me, actually finding fault with how I'd behaved, as if the problem was my failure to properly perform rather than his parents' blatant classism and cruelty. I felt something break inside me in that moment. Whatever remaining hope I'd had that Marcus was different from his parents, that he was somehow trapped in their expectations but fundamentally opposed to their values, it shattered completely. And I realized that he was exactly like them. He'd just been better at hiding it, more skilled at making his judgment seem like concern, his contempt seem like constructive criticism. "Marcus," I said, and this time I let my real voice come through, clear and articulate and completely different from the character I'd been playing all evening. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to say." He glanced over at me, confused by the sudden change in my voice, in my demeanor, and I could see the moment when he started to realize that something was very wrong, that the evening was about to take a turn he hadn't anticipated. "Everything you saw tonight, everything you heard me say, the way I acted, the way I spoke, the person I presented to your parents, that wasn't me. That was a character I was playing, a test I designed because I needed to know the truth about who you are, about who your family is, and about what kind of life you actually want me to live." His face went pale. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, and he started to stammer out a response, but I held up my hand to stop him because I wasn't finished, not even close. "I'm a corporate lawyer, Marcus. I graduated summa cum laude from Yale Law School. I have a master's degree in international business. I speak 4 languages fluently. I've represented Fortune 500 companies, and I make more money than you do. A lot more money, in case you were wondering. But you never asked about my work, did you? You never really wanted to know about my cases, my achievements, my ambitions, because on some level, you were always uncomfortable with the idea of being with someone who might be more successful, more educated, more accomplished than you are." The car swerved slightly as he processed what I was saying, and I could see his mind working, trying to reconcile the person he thought he knew with the person I actually was. "I wore cheap clothes and pretended to be uneducated tonight because I wanted to see how your parents would treat someone they perceived as beneath them, and the answer is that they treated that person with contempt, condescension, and barely disguised disgust. But here's the thing, Marcus. That's not even the worst part." I paused, making sure he was really listening, really understanding the gravity of what I was about to tell him. "The worst part is that while I was supposedly in the bathroom, I heard your parents talking about me in the kitchen. I heard every word they said about how unsuitable I am, how they have clauses in your trust fund to discourage you from marrying someone like me, how they're already planning to set you up with Bethany Worthington from the country club. And I heard them say that they think this is just a phase, that you're using me to rebel against them, and that you'll come to your senses soon." Marcus pulled the car over abruptly, parking on the side of the road, his face drained of all color, and he turned to look at me with an expression of horror mixed with shame. "I can explain," he started, but I cut him off again because I'd been silent too long already, playing roles and swallowing my voice, and I was done with that. "Can you explain why you brought me to that dinner knowing your parents would judge me? Can you explain why you didn't defend me once during the entire evening? Can you explain why you criticized me on the drive home instead of apologizing for how they treated me? Can you explain why you've spent 2 years making little comments about how I could be different, softer, less focused on my career, less ambitious, less myself?" My voice was rising now, all the anger and hurt I'd been suppressing. For hours, maybe even months, coming to the surface. Marcus looked like he'd been punched, his mouth opening and closing, but no words coming out. And I realized that he'd never actually had to face the reality of who he was, who his family was, because people like them rarely do. They move through the world in their bubble of privilege and judgment, never having to confront the harm they cause because everyone around them is too polite or too intimidated to call them out. "I loved you," I continued, and I could hear my voice breaking slightly, the emotion finally overwhelming the anger. "I really loved you, or at least I loved who I thought you were. But tonight showed me the truth. You're not the man I thought you were. You're not someone who would stand up for me, defend me, love me for who I actually am. You're someone who wants a wife who fits a specific mold, who makes your parents happy, who doesn't challenge you or outshine you or make waves in your comfortable, privileged world." Marcus finally found his voice, and what he said was somehow worse than if he'd said nothing at all. "You tricked me," he said, his tone accusing, almost indignant. "You deliberately deceived me and my parents. You made me look bad. You set us up to fail this test of yours. How is that fair? How is that honest? The audacity of it, the complete lack of self-awareness, was almost breathtaking. He was upset that I'd tricked him, as if that was the real problem here, as if my deception was somehow worse than his parents' classism or his own cowardice. You want to talk about honesty, Marcus? Let's talk about honesty. You've never been honest with me about what you really wanted. You've never been honest about your parents' expectations or the conditions on your trust fund. You've never been honest about the fact that you were trying to change me into someone more acceptable to your family. You've been deceptive from the beginning. You just did it with subtle suggestions and gentle corrections instead of outright lies, but it's deception all the same. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions swirling inside me, and I made the decision that I'd probably known I was going to make from the moment I heard his parents talking in that kitchen. This engagement is over, Marcus. I can't marry someone who doesn't respect me, who doesn't value me for who I truly am, who would allow his parents to treat me with such contempt without saying a single word in my defense. I deserve better than that. Better than you. Better than your family and your trust funds and your country club friends. I pulled off the engagement ring, the one he'd presented to me 6 months ago in a romantic proposal that now felt tainted by everything I'd learned tonight, and I held it out to him. He stared at the ring like he couldn't comprehend what was happening, like his world was tilting off its axis. And maybe it was. Maybe this was the first time in his life that someone had rejected him, chosen to walk away from the privilege and comfort he could offer, because the cost of being with him was too high. You're really ending this because of one dinner? Because my parents didn't immediately fall in love with you? He was still trying to frame this as my overreaction, my problem, my failure to see things correctly. I'm ending this because of who you are, Marcus. This isn't about one dinner. It's about 2 years of you trying to dim my light, make me smaller, turn me into someone I'm not. It's about you bringing me to meet your parents knowing they would judge me, knowing you'd set me up for failure. Because some part of you doesn't want to be with someone like me, someone who's successful and independent and doesn't need you or your family's money or approval. You want someone who'll be grateful for the opportunity to marry into your family, someone who'll play the role they've written without question, and that's not me. That will never be me. I got out of the car because I couldn't sit there anymore, couldn't breathe the same air as him, and I called a ride on my phone, standing on the sidewalk in the cool night air, feeling the weight of the evening settling over me like a heavy blanket. Marcus got out too, coming around the car, and for a moment I thought he might actually fight for us, might actually say something that would make a difference, but instead he just looked confused and hurt, like I'd broken some unspoken rule by refusing to play along with his family's expectations. My parents will come around, he said weakly. Once they get to know the real you, once they see how accomplished you are, they'll change their minds. The fact that he thought that would somehow make things better showed how little he understood about what was actually wrong here. It wasn't about whether his parents would eventually accept me. It was about the fact that their acceptance was conditional, based on my credentials and accomplishments, rather than my inherent worth as a human being. And it was about the fact that he thought this was acceptable, that he saw nothing wrong with his parents' values or his own complicity in them. My ride arrived and I got in without looking back, leaving Marcus standing on the sidewalk, still holding the engagement ring, still probably not fully understanding what had just happened or why. And as we drove away, I felt a complex mixture of emotions washing over me. There was grief for the relationship I'd thought I had, for the future I'd imagined, for the love I'd believed in. But there was also relief, a profound sense of having dodged a bullet, of having discovered the truth before it was too late, before I'd legally tied myself to a man and a family who would have spent the rest of my life trying to make me smaller, quieter, less than who I am. The days that followed were difficult in ways I hadn't anticipated, because breaking off an engagement isn't just about ending a romantic relationship. It's about unwinding all the plans you'd made, telling all the people you'd shared your happiness with that it wasn't going to happen after all, facing the questions and the sympathy and the judgment from people who thought they understood but really didn't. My friends were supportive, especially Rachel, who didn't say I told you so even though she'd earned the right to, and my family, who'd never quite warmed to Marcus anyway, was relieved in a way they tried to hide but couldn't completely. Marcus tried to contact me multiple times in those first few weeks, leaving voicemails that ranged from apologetic to angry to confused, and I listened to a few of them before deciding that there was nothing he could say that would change what I knew to be true about him and about us. In one voicemail, he actually said that his mother had suggested we try again, that she'd said maybe she'd been too harsh in her judgment, which made me laugh bitterly because it confirmed everything I suspected. They weren't sorry for their behavior. They were just recalculating their approach. probably because Marcus had told them the truth about who I really was, and they'd realized they'd misjudged the situation. But the damage was done, not because they'd been cruel to someone they thought was beneath them, that was bad enough, but because they'd revealed who they truly were when they thought no one was watching, when they thought there would be no consequences for their contempt and snobbery, and that's not something you can take back or apologize away. I threw myself into my work, taking on bigger cases, accepting that partnership offer I'd been considering, and slowly rebuilding my sense of self that had been eroded during my time with Marcus, because I realized that I'd been compromising little pieces of myself throughout our relationship, not in obvious ways but in small, incremental adjustments that added up to something significant. I'd stopped talking about my work successes as much because I'd noticed he got quiet and moody when I did. I'd downplayed my achievements to make him feel more comfortable. I'd been shrinking myself to fit into the space he was willing to give me, and I hadn't even fully realized I was doing it until I stopped. About 3 months after that disastrous dinner, I heard through mutual acquaintances that Marcus had started dating Bethany Worthington, the Harvard MBA his mother had mentioned, and I felt a twinge of something. Not jealousy exactly, but maybe sadness for both of them, because I doubted she was being allowed to be fully herself either. She was probably just better at playing the role his family demanded, more willing to mold herself into their expectations, or maybe she genuinely wanted the same things they did and would be happy in that world. Either way, it wasn't my concern anymore, and I wished them well in my thoughts, even as I felt grateful that it wasn't me stepping into that role, wearing that mask, living that life. The experience changed me in fundamental ways that I'm still processing. It made me more cautious about who I trust, more vigilant about red flags in relationships, but it also made me stronger, more certain of who I am and what I will and won't accept in my life. And that's worth something. I learned that love isn't enough if it's not accompanied by respect, genuine acceptance, and the courage to stand up for what's right even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. I learned that people will show you who they really are if you pay attention, not in the grand gestures or the romantic moments, but in the small comments, the subtle corrections, the way they treat people they think don't matter. And I learned that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from something that looks good on paper, that makes sense to everyone else, that should work but doesn't because you know in your heart that it's not right for you. So here I am now, single, focused on my career, surrounded by friends who truly value me for who I am. And while I'd be lying if I said I don't sometimes feel lonely or wonder what it would be like if I'd made different choices, I know with absolute certainty that I made the right decision that night, standing on that sidewalk, handing back that ring, choosing myself over the comfort of a relationship that required me to be less than I am. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between being yourself and being accepted by someone you loved? Have you ever discovered that the person you were with wanted you to change in fundamental ways? Drop your stories in the comments below because I think we all need to share these experiences. We need to let each other know that it's okay to walk away. It's okay to demand respect. It's okay to refuse to shrink yourself to fit into someone else's expectations. And if this story resonated with you, if it made you think about your own relationships or helped you see a situation in your life more clearly, please hit that like button because it really does help this channel reach more people who might need to hear these messages. Understanding the dynamics of respect, acceptance, and genuine love in relationships is so important, and the more we talk about these issues openly, the more we can help each other navigate the complicated terrain of modern relationships and family expectations. Make sure you subscribe to my Truth Revealed Tales for more real stories about relationships, personal growth, and the complicated truths we discover about ourselves and the people in our lives. Because I share these stories not just to process my own experiences, but to create a community where we can all be honest about the messy, difficult, beautiful reality of being human and trying to connect with others authentically. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a new story. And remember that your worth is not determined by someone else's ability to see it. You are valuable, you are enough, and you deserve to be loved for exactly who you are, not for who someone else wants you to become. Thank you so much for listening to my story, for being part of this community, and for sharing your own experiences in the comments. I read every single one of them, and they mean more to me than you might realize. Knowing that we're all out here trying to figure this out together, supporting each other, learning from each other's mistakes and triumphs, that's what makes this space so special. So please keep the conversation going. Keep being vulnerable and honest. And I'll be back soon with another story, another truth revealed, Another piece of the puzzle of what it means to live authentically in a world that often wants us to be anything but ourselves.